In today's video, we're going over every single change I found between Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark's movie and the 3 books that inspired it. The new Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark movie is a big deal for horror fans who grew up in the 90s like me. Alvin Schwartz really understood the idea that less is more. His stories were only a couple pages long at most, and when you combine them with Stephen Gammell's excellent and terrifying art, it really did give kids, myself included, extremely vivid nightmares for years to come. You already know this, but the general reaction to movies like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is pretty much skepticism all around. It's not controversial at all to say Hollywood likes to take concepts like this and cash in on them with super cheap horror movies that they can throw into theaters at the end of August or the beginning of September. But this one has been in the works for a long time. CBS Films actually bought the rights to the books back in 2013, and they've been trying to get a movie going ever since. It's no secret that they had trouble getting this movie off the ground until 2016 when Guillermo del Toro signed on and he rewrote a script from Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan. Now, the reason I mention their names is because they're going to be familiar to you if you're a fan of my channel. They're the guys behind the Halloween Return script that was never used, but they also wrote a bunch of the Saw movies and The Collector. Anyway, at the end of the day, Guillermo del Toro turned out to be the key to getting things moving on Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and then Andre Overdahl was signed on to direct it. Overdahl's name is also one that you've definitely heard on my channel before because he's behind the criminally underseen movie Troll Hunter. If you've been on Netflix like ever, you've probably seen it scrolling through the horror movies. He also directed the movie The Autopsy of Jane Doe, which is one of my all-time favorite witch movies. It is so good. So I was really happy to see that he signed on to this movie. There's a lot of reasons I think this movie was a resounding success overall, but the biggest one has to be that del Toro and Overdahl understood that when it comes to Alvin Schwartz books and Stephen Gammell's art, you really can't have one without the other. I mean, we all know that Scholastic learned that the hard way when they re-released the books a few years back with the wrong art. Obviously, the writing in the movie was on point, the kid actors in it did a phenomenal job, and I love the time period of 1968. I'm kind of getting sick of the 80s nostalgia, so going that far back was genuinely cool to me. I know we just got it in Annabelle Comes Home, and obviously Once Upon a Time in Hollywood takes place in 1969. It's just a generally unexplored time period in horror, and I hope we get more stuff like it down the line. I mean, yeah, this movie might not make a ton of money in its theatrical run, but this will definitely become a cult classic, and I know that it's going right next to Trick or Treat on my shelf of Blu-rays, so I can take it off and watch it every year around Halloween. Arguably, the biggest and best change from the books to the movies is that this is not an anthology film. It's kind of like a pseudo-anthology film because there is a story tying all of the mini-stories together, and I think that works really well. And the way that the movie connects all the stories is super clever. It actually takes all of the short stories from all 3 books and collects them into just one. The main story takes place around Halloween time in 1968 in a small Pennsylvania town called Mill Valley. Out on the edge of town, there's a huge abandoned, supposedly haunted mansion that used to be owned by the Bellows family. One of the Bellows named Sarah had a pretty troubled upbringing because she was locked away in the basement for being different. She was born with striking white hair, eyes, and skin, and the way she coped with that was by writing scary stories that involved her family members. The group of friends the movie follows decide to start exploring the Bellows mansion on Halloween night, and they end up finding Sarah's book full of scary stories. Guillermo del Toro feels that anthology movies are only remembered for their worst short, so he was scared that they'd come up with 5 different stories, but one of them might not turn out great, and that's all people would be able to talk about. And because of that, instead of taking the 5 or 6 best stories and just throwing them on screen as an anthology, they're actually all connected in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And I think that works really well because the story itself is actually pretty emotional. And in case you didn't notice, Sarah Bellows' story is actually a twist on one of the book's best stories, The Haunted House. In the book, the story follows a preacher who heads up to a local haunted house because nobody will stay there because it's haunted. Once he gets up to the house, he sits down and lights a fire, and then he starts reading his Bible. And after a while, he actually hears some footsteps and some tapping on the walls, but he decides not to leave. Because he doesn't leave, the ghost feels okay presenting herself to the preacher, and she tells him that she was murdered in the house and her bones were dropped into the basement. And instead of hurting him, she asks him to collect the bones and give her a proper burial. The twist happens when the preacher brings the bones back to his church and a guy touches them and one of the finger bones sticks to his. And for some reason, that makes him break down and confess to the murder, and he's thrown in jail for the rest of his life. Now, in the movie, the haunted house is obviously the Bellows mansion, and Sarah Bellows is the ghost. Because there's so many rumors about her for being different spread around town and everyone is kind of scared of her, they take her to the hospital and get her to confess to the crimes through torturing her. As the legend goes, she committed suicide by hanging herself with her own hair, but we really know that her siblings killed her. As far as we know, Sarah's bones aren't buried in the basement and Stella isn't a priest, so the resolution in the movie comes from Stella saying that she'll tell Sarah's story and make sure everyone knows the truth, and she has to do that by writing it in blood in Sarah's book. I actually really like this change a lot. It's obvious obviously a lot different from the source material, but I like that they used the source material to draw inspiration for the movie's wrapper instead of coming up with something totally new. The next story is one that they definitely couldn't leave out, and that's Harold the Scarecrow. And from the very beginning, since we saw the first poster for this movie, we knew it would be in the final product, and I think that was the one that they needed to say, hey, this will be in the movie. In the books, Harold is a scarecrow that two farmhands make in the image of another farmer that they hate. They basically go out in the field and get drunk and harass this scarecrow until one day he comes alive. And then he kills them, and then he rolls their skins out on the roof so that they'll tan and basically turns them into leather. In the movie, it's the school bully Tommy Milner who's attacked by Harold. After he destroys Ramon's car for protecting Augie, Stella, and Chuck, he heads home and has to take some eggs to his neighbor. So on the way, he obviously body checks Harold. The source material is admittedly a little too dark for a PG-13 movie, so once Harold comes to life, he actually just ends up chasing Tommy through an infinite cornfield. While he's running, Tommy trips over a pitchfork and stabs Harold, but it obviously does nothing because all he is just like a pole with another pole and some straw. So Harold turns around and stabs Tommy with the pitchfork. It's pretty awesome. At first I was kind of disappointed they went that route because you do see the pitchfork come through Tommy's chest and it looks pretty cool, but there's no blood. And then I realized that they were gonna have straw start coming out of the holes. And then it starts coming out of his ears and then his nose and his mouth and his eyes. And then he becomes a scarecrow that replaces Harold, which is just perfect. So yeah, it's definitely not as gruesome or as gory as it is in the book, but it's still just as terrifying, and that would scare the shit out of me if I was 13 years old and was faced with body horror like that. Like, you see him become the Scarecrow, and I love that. Big Toe is another story that's adapted from the books, and just like Harold the Scarecrow, it's altered just a little bit for the movie. In the book, a kid is playing in his backyard and he sees a big toe sticking out of the dirt in their family garden. So he pulls and pulls on it and eventually it comes off. So he brings it inside and gives it to his mom for some reason, and she cooks it into their soup for dinner. That night they all eat the soup and everything seems fine until later when a corpse starts walking through their house screaming, "Where's my toe?" In the movie, the night after Tommy goes missing, Augie goes home just as his friends realize his story is being written. Of course, they read the main part of the story and tell him not to eat anything. Unfortunately for Augie, he's a skeptic and doesn't believe anything's going on, so when he goes in his fridge and finds a big pot of stew, he takes a huge bite. That huge bite of stew he takes ends up having the big toe in it, and well, I guess we all know how the story goes from there. I like this one a lot because it's not a huge departure from the books, but it also plays on the fact that Augie is chastising Chuck all night for eating the candy that's full of preservatives and other chemicals. And yeah, I also love the detail on his fingernails digging into the wood as he's dragged into the darkness of the wall. Next up, we have the red spot, and this story follows Chuck's sister Ruth in the movie. She's kind of a drama queen and she's afraid of imperfection, so obviously the book writes a story about her getting a massive pimple on the side of her face. Just like in the short story, the pimple grows bigger and bigger throughout the day, and in the movie, Ruth is about to be in the school play, so someone tells her she has to go to the bathroom and pop it. As she runs to the bathroom, the pimple gets bigger and bigger and even starts moving, and once she gets there, it pops and a billion little baby spiders crawl out of her face. And as someone with pretty bad acne, as I'm sure you've noticed, that was like top 10 terrifying moments in my life for me, seeing that play out. Yeah, I didn't really like that all too much. The reason I didn't tell you the short story first on this one is because it's as close to the source material as it gets. That story was really simple. It was about a girl named Ruth who woke up one day with a pimple on her face and her mom tells her not to pop it. So she actually listens to her mom, which is weird because that's what you're supposed to do, not pop pimples. But then once it grows huge and she does try and pop it, all the spiders come out. Anyway, in the movie, she's actually one of the characters who gets to live because Chuck, Ramon, and Stella get there in the nick of time and throw a bucket of water on her, and that washes all the spiders out of the gaping cavity in her face. It kind of doesn't make sense, but I also don't think that would necessarily kill you since it's just her cheek. Anyway, moving on, the Pale Lady was one of my favorite drawings in the entire book series, so when I saw her in the trailer, I was so excited to see her come to life. The effect done on her is incredible because not only is it all practical, but she looks exactly like she does in the third book story called The Dream. In the book, a woman travels to a town called Dorset and rents a hotel room because she's been having nightmares where she's visited by the Pale Lady. She has the same nightmare, and as it turns out, the room she rented is the room from her dreams, and the Pale Lady appears at the door in front of her. In the movie, it's Chuck who encounters the Pale Lady. It's when him and Ramon and Stella go to the hospital to find some records on Sarah Bellows. He tells them he's been having the nightmare about the Red Room, and it turns out that the records room is literally called the Red Room, so he doesn't go with them. He's sneaking through the hospital, and a bunch of orderlies chase him up to the second floor, and when they set off the alarm to let everyone know that there's a kid running around, the whole thing turns red. Once the alarm goes off and the hallway he's in turns into the red room, the pale lady enters and starts walking towards him really slowly. It's kind of creepy, but once he turns around, the hallway on the other end also has a pale lady. And then he turns the other way kind of like 90 degrees and there's another pale lady. And then he turns around and there's another hallway and there's another pale lady. At the end of the day, there's 4 pale ladies and they all meet in the middle and absorb Chuck into their bodies with a huge bear hug. That kill was especially horrifying to me because it actually feels like a nightmare. It's like before the kids realize they can fight back against Freddy in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. And it's playing off Chuck's annoyance when his mom hugs him really tight when he's wearing a Spider-Man costume earlier in the movie. From the very beginning, Guillermo del Toro and Andre Overdahl have been talking about a decision they made that might be controversial, and that was to come up with their own story to go with the ones they pulled from the books. And as it turns out, they really had nothing to worry about because that story is actually just a combination of 3 stories from all 3 books. The 3 stories are Me, Tidody Walker, What Do You Come For, and Aaron Kelly's Bones, and the monster that's combined from all those stories is called the Jangly Man. Whether it's a head rolling down a chimney, a bunch of bones coming together and dancing around, or a decomposing man putting himself back together in front of your eyes, the common theme between each story is dismemberment and murder. And after Stella and Ramon are captured at the hospital and thrown in jail, the story actually does start out a lot like Me, Tidody Walker. In both the book and the movie, the Jangly Man's head rolls down the chimney and the dog in the room says Lynchy, Kinchy, Kali, Molly, Dingo, Dingo. And after that, the Jangly Man reconstructs himself in front of the sheriff's eyes. And once he is constructed, that is all a practical suit. The creature design is top notch, and I'm afraid of anything that scuttles, like anything that lives on the ocean floor like a crab or a lobster, and he definitely scuttles, so I was pretty freaked out by him. And the reason he can remember and dismember and just member himself, if that's a verb I can really use here, is because Ramon's brother went to Vietnam and was shipped back in a bunch of pieces. One small change from the book is that when the boy confronts the Jangly Man in the story, he actually just goes insane and doesn't die. That fate is actually given to Ruth for like half the movie after her face explodes with spiders. That's the last story that plays directly into the movie's plot, but there are other ones referenced all over the film, like one called The Windigo that's actually written about one of Sarah's siblings. Another one I saw referenced when they were flipping through Sarah's book is The Cat's Paw, and I would have loved to see that one because it references a werecat. Another shot of Sarah's book I saw in the trailer had a story called The Attic, and that story is actually pretty cool. I just don't know how it would have played into the movie's plot. And finally, during the intro montage when we see Stella's room, there's a typewriter on her desk with a story called The Whistle House or The Whistling Man or something. I couldn't find any stories in the books referencing whistling or a whistling man, but there are a ton of creepy whistling man stories on the internet, and I highly suggest you seek them out for yourself. So that about covers the differences between the 3 books and the movie. If you had as much fun watching this video as I did making it, make sure you let me know down in the comments below, and when you subscribe, make sure you hit the notification bell. Also, be sure to let me know what you thought of the movie if you go check it out. Anyway guys, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.